Hey, so I know it's super late, and I hope you can hear me. I can't sleep. I had a really big day yesterday. Anyway, so my hair's a mess. We are starting a new book, and it is Toxic Communities. Toxic Communities, Environmental Racism, Industrial Pollution, and Residential Mobility by Dorceta E. Taylor. And about the author, Dorceta E. Taylor is professor in the School of Natural Resources and Environment at the University of Michigan, where she also serves as Field of Studies Coordinator for the Environmental Justice Program. She graduated from Yale University with a doctorate in Sociology, Forestry, and Environmental Studies. Her previous books include The Environment and the People in American Cities and Disorder, Inequality, and Social Change, which won the 2011 Alan Schneeberg Outstanding Publication Award from the Environment and Technology section of the American Sociological Association. So, it's going to be set up kind of like my Jim Crow, but I'm not using teaching tolerance this time. This time I am using, I do believe that it is the New York University Press.org. I found a teaching guide. I'm not making any money off of this, and I don't even put ads on my thing. So no money's being made off of this. I'm doing this because I think it's important and I really like this book. So I'll have links to this and where I got this on my website. So, but tonight I wanted to go over the introduction with you because I thought that would be the easiest thing. And it's only 3 pages. So now, also, this book has a lot of abbreviations and acronyms. There's a lot of them. So, when I see them, I'm probably just going to say them out loud because some people kind of jump on, kind of like off and on intermittently. So, I'm probably going to just say them unless it's DDT because I'm going to have fun saying blah. But so anyway, the acronyms and the abbreviations are added to my glossary. But I've actually, you go onto my website, and then you see glossary, and you click on it, and then you'll see it says glossary, and then it has like a little thing in like gray, and it says A through Z terms at the top, and then A through Z abbreviations and acronyms at the bottom. That just means scroll to the very bottom of the alphabet, and then right below the full words, you'll have the acronyms alphabet. So, anyway, Toxic Communities by Dorceta E. Taylor. Introduction. Environmental justice claims. 2 of the most controversial claims of the environmental justice movement, EJM, are the assertions that hazardous facilities are concentrated in minority and low-income communities in the United States, and that these communities are exposed to inordinate amounts of environmental hazards. These claims are often used to spur mobilization around environmental issues such as communities, or in such communities. Though I have elsewhere documented a long history of noxious and hazardous facilities being located within or close to minority and low-income communities, the evidence of minority environmental activism that predates the 20th century, it is only in the past 3 decades that a sustained movement focused on the environmental inequalities has arisen. The rise of contemporary EJM, environmental justice movement, coincides with the emergence of environmental justice, ooh, bad kitty, scholarship policies, legal challenges, and so on. During the 1960s and 1970s, there was a marked shift in minority responses to environmental inequalities that laid the groundwork for the EJM. Minority activists became more deliberate in their environmental activism. They linked environment with racial and other kinds of social inequalities and framed the issues in terms of rights to safe and healthy environments. Minorities also agitated for more research on environmental inequalities, treatments of illnesses arising from exposure to environmental hazards, policies to facilitate improvement in conditions, and legal redress of harm suffered. In addition, minority scholars and activists began to write and speak about environmental issues in the 1970s by linking them with the race and social inequality. Why don't they just move? Several events related to the sitting of hazardous facilities and dumping of hazardous wastes and the contamination of minority communities led to the emergence of the EJM in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The movement asserted that minorities and poor lived in the most degraded environments. Among other things, movement activists argued that minority communities hosted a disproportionate number of hazardous and noxious facilities. were destroyed for freeways or commercial development and deprived of amenities such as parks and open space, and were saddled with poor transportation and bad garbage removal services. Environmental justice activists coined the term environmental racism to describe the process that resulted in minority and low-income communities facing disproportionate environmental harms and limited environmental benefits. In response to these claims, skeptics have asked the question, why don't they move? The question is asked of rural and urban communities that articulate the aforementioned types of environmental justice claims. Famed civil rights activist and field secretary of the state of the Mississippi's National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, Medgar Evers, reflected on the question in a 1958 essay titled, "Why I Live in Mississippi." Evers said, "It may sound funny, but I love the South. I don't choose to live anywhere else. There's land here, and a man can raise cattle, and I'm going to do that someday. There are lakes where a man can sink a hook and fight the bass. There is room for my children to play and grow and become good citizens." Gail Small, a member of the Northern Cheyenne tribe and executive director of Native Action in Lame Deer, Montana, responds this way: "I've always known that this is the place I was meant to be. This is my source of strength here. This land that I live on today with my 4 kids is my mother's family's land. And her family, they're buried right behind us here in the hills. The land is tied to the culture, to the language, to the viewpoint. There's a tremendous spiritual connection to our homeland." Evers and Small are referring to access to land, ownership of it, and connection to it as reasons why people do not move. They're also referring to the challenges that poor rural residents face in considering relocation to places where they will not have enough funds to purchase land or new home, or must forego supplementing their income with subsistence activities. Urbanites in communities exposed to environmental hazards also face an array of challenges if and when they consider relocation. This book examines the underlying assumptions behind this and similar questions, and analyzes the forces that constrain, compel, or encourage the movement of minorities. It examines the expulsion of minorities from desirable land and communities, the demolition of their neighborhoods and relocation of minorities to segregated neighborhoods, and the construction of minority neighborhoods in undesirable locations. Moreover, this book examines how industrial processes expose minorities and low-income people to dangerous environmental conditions. Throughout, the book explores why minorities live in communities with hazardous facilities in them or close by. Hence, the book focuses on 3 key questions. Why do minorities live adjacent to hazardous facilities or become exposed to environmental hazards? Why do they not move? And who or what keeps them from moving? Theories, arguments, research, and evidence. Environmental justice movement claims and activism have stimulated a robust area of research and inquiry. This book focuses on one of the largest and most contentious areas of environmental justice research: the exposure to environmental hazards and industrial activities in minority and low-income communities. The book reviews the research in the field. Though several scholars have published reviews of environmental justice research, the review attempted in this book explores the relationship between exposure to environmental hazards and residential mobility, more comprehensively and systematically than earlier publications have. It examines the theories and arguments that have been put forward to explain these phenomena and discusses the evidence presented to support or refute the claims of researchers, environmental justice advocates, and environmental justice skeptics. This book urges environmental justice researchers to pay more attention to both rural and urban EJ issues, and to refine their methods to account for the same complexity of EJ issues. This book demonstrates that some of the same processes that have been identified and investigated in urban settings, such as segregation and displacement, also occur in rural context in ways that influence outcomes. Unlike Jeffries, who argues that the fact remains that environmental problems from a minority perspective are rather trivial in comparison to the larger economic and civil liberty issues, this book illustrates that environmental issues are vitally important to minorities. Many minorities recognize this importance and are deeply engaged in environmental affairs. Overview of this book. Chapter 1 examines several landmark environmental justice cases occurring in the black communities in the South that led to the activism around environmental issues. These cases help the reader to understand the mechanisms by which communities of color are found in close proximity to hazardous facilities. The author examines the claim of disproportionate sitting, racism, and discrimination in Chapter 2. Chapter 3 examines the internal colonialism thesis in cases occurring in Native American communities in the West. Here, too, the process by which hazardous facilities and industrial operations occur in or adjacent to minority communities are explored. In Chapter 4, I examine several theses and arguments. I'm reading as the author, I examine several theses and arguments that can be grouped together under the category of market dynamics. These theses examine several arguments related to residential mobility. They home in on the question of who moves or stays when people are confronted with the likelihood that they may be exposed to environmental hazards. Chapter 5 examines how the legal, regulatory, and administrative context influence sitting, exposure to hazards, and the ability of jurisdictions to enact and enforce environmental protections. Chapter 6 discusses the roles of manipulation, enticement, and environmental blackmail in the sitting process and the operation of hazardous facilities. The rest of the book focuses on the relationship between segregation, housing choices, and residential mobility. Chapter 7 examines residential segregation and the rise of racialized zoning, while Chapter 8 explores the use of restrictive covenants to foster residential segregation. Chapter 9 explores eminent domain, urban renewal, and contemporary forms of expulsive zoning. It also discusses segregation in public housing. Chapter 10 assesses whether housing discrimination is a thing of the past or still a contemporary phenomenon. The conclusion briefly discusses the future directions of environmental justice research. And that is the end of the introduction. And then we go into Chapter 1, and then I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to do that because they're really long chapters, and they got some really wonderful chemical names in there, and I sound like Jed Clampett, but we just finished up the new Jim Crow, and the new Jim Crow really talked about how there's institutionalized racism that does exist here in the United States. So I want to take that a step further, especially with everything that happened in like Standing Rock in North Dakota, which is environmental racism. They purposely took it out of, let's say Bismarck, North Dakota, because it was a white population, and they put it right through the Native American land and ruined the land. That's environmental racism. The most polluted area code in Los Angeles is a black and brown community. Here in, well, you know what happened in Louisiana when they had Katrina. Black and brown communities suffered. Most of the refineries, the people who live next to them are black and brown people. Same thing that happened here in Texas, in the South. Now, Houston's got a lot of environmental racism going on, but like the people who are stuck, black and brown folks in Puerto Rico right now, environmental racism. We're not getting down there as fast as we are because they're brown. Like, the only way that we're going to fix this is if we address it, and we have to call it what it is. And we have to be able to look around the world around us and say, oh, I see that. A spade's a spade. So that's why I have decided to go directly into this. If I have to read the entire chapters, I will to you. But if you are able to get this book, definitely go do it. Local libraries are still a thing. And anyway, I will get back to you with chapter 1. Anyway, thank you. And I'm so excited. New book, new book.